What does it mean when the most powerful man in a country disappears from public view for weeks and then reemerges not with a speech, but with a decision? Because that's exactly the pattern that just played out, and it's a pattern that tells you far more than any public statement possibly could. For weeks, Iran's top leadership was conspicuously absent from public view. No major addresses, no high-profile meetings broadcast on state television, no visible presence at the kind of ceremonial and political events that, under normal circumstances, would be impossible to imagine him missing. That silence generated exactly the kind of speculation you'd expect. Questions about health, questions about internal political struggles, questions about whether the absence reflected something far more serious than a simple scheduling gap. And then, without a public reappearance, without a speech explaining the silence, the first visible sign that leadership was still actively directing events came not through words, but through a specific consequential decision. So the real question isn't just what that decision was. The real question is what weeks of silence, followed by action instead of explanation, actually tells you about what's happening at the top of a government that has spent decades cultivating an image of unshakable, ever-present control. Before we go any further, if you want to understand what's actually happening behind moments like this, instead of just reacting to the speculation swirling around them, hit subscribe right now. This channel breaks down exactly how to read situations like this one, when the absence of information becomes just as revealing as the information itself. And this is one of the most important examples you'll see this year. Let's start with the silence itself, because understanding exactly what made this absence so unusual is the first step toward understanding why it mattered so much. Leadership visibility, in a system built the way Iran's political structure is built, isn't simply a matter of personal preference or scheduling convenience. It's a core mechanism of how authority is projected and maintained. Regular public appearances, addresses to the nation during moments of crisis, meetings with foreign dignitaries and domestic officials broadcast for public consumption, all serve a specific function beyond their immediate content. They reassure the population, and just as importantly, they reassure the internal power structure, the security services, the political establishment, the network of officials whose continued loyalty depends partly on confidence that leadership remains firmly in control, that the person at the top remains actively engaged and capable of directing events. When that visibility suddenly stops, especially during a period of active international conflict and significant internal economic strain, the absence itself becomes a kind of signal, regardless of what's actually causing it. And because authoritarian systems like this one typically operate with limited independent media able to investigate and report accurately on leadership, health, and activity, that signal tends to generate speculation precisely because there's no reliable, independent way to distinguish between several very different possible explanations, each with dramatically different implications for the country's political trajectory. The first possible explanation is health-related, and it's the one that tends to generate the most immediate speculation, precisely because leadership age and health status in systems like this one are often treated as closely guarded information, sometimes for genuine security reasons, sometimes simply because uncertainty about succession and continuity is seen internally as more dangerous to manage than confirmed bad news would be. A serious health issue, if that's what's actually behind an extended absence, creates enormous internal uncertainty about succession planning, a question this particular political system has historically handled with extreme secrecy, given how much internal negotiation and factional maneuvering typically surrounds succession decisions in systems without established, transparent democratic transition processes. The second possible explanation is a security concern, either a genuine, specific threat that led to an extended period of restricted public appearances as a protective measure, or a broader, more general heightened security posture, given the active conflict conditions the country has been operating under. This explanation, if accurate, would suggest less about internal political instability and more about the practical realities of maintaining leadership safety during an active, ongoing military confrontation, though it still raises real questions about how effectively leadership can actually direct complex, fast-moving events while operating under those kinds of security restrictions. The third possible explanation, and the one that tends to generate the most serious analytical attention, is internal political struggle. Some kind of behind-the-scenes maneuvering among competing factions within the security and political establishment that either directly limited leadership's ability to appear publicly, or that leadership itself calculated required a period of reduced visibility while internal negotiations, alliances, or power struggles played out away from public scrutiny. This explanation is genuinely difficult to confirm or rule out from outside observation, precisely because it's exactly the kind of internal dynamic this system has spent decades becoming extremely effective at keeping hidden from both its own population and outside analysts. There's a fourth explanation worth considering as well, one that doesn't necessarily exclude the other three, but that adds an important layer of nuance often missing from more simplistic speculation. It's entirely possible that the extended absence reflects a deliberate, calculated strategic choice, not because leadership was unable to appear publicly, but because remaining visibly silent during a specific, sensitive phase of the broader conflict was judged internally to be strategically advantageous. Silence can function as its own form of signal in high-stakes negotiations and military standoffs, denying adversaries and outside analysts the kind of readable cues that public statements and appearances typically provide, while internal decision-making continues uninterrupted behind the scenes. Under this explanation, the absence wouldn't represent weakness or incapacity at all, but a deliberate information denial strategy, one that becomes considerably harder to distinguish from genuine incapacity from the outside, which may be precisely part of its strategic value. If you're starting to see how much genuine uncertainty surrounds even the most basic question of why this silence happened in the first place, make sure you're subscribed, because the next part explains exactly what changed when the silence finally broke, and why the specific way it broke matters just as much as the fact that it did. Here's where this story gets genuinely interesting, because the way leadership's silence ended tells you something that a simple public reappearance never could have. A straightforward return to public view, a speech, a televised meeting, a ceremonial appearance, would have sent one specific kind of signal, an attempt to directly address and dispel the speculation that had been building throughout the absence, reassuring both domestic and international observers that leadership remained fully capable and firmly in control. That's not what happened here. Instead, the silence ended through a specific, consequential decision, communicated through official channels and government action rather than through a personal, visible reappearance. This distinction matters enormously, and it's worth taking the time to understand exactly why. Communicating through decisive action rather than direct public appearance can actually serve a specific strategic purpose, one that's easy to overlook if you're only looking for the most obvious explanation. Action demonstrates control more convincingly, in some ways, than words alone ever could. Anyone can deliver a reassuring speech. Directing a consequential, complicated decision, one that requires coordinating multiple parts of the government and security apparatus to actually execute, demonstrates something a speech cannot: that the systems of governance and command are still functioning, still capable of producing coordinated action, regardless of whatever uncertainty surrounded the extended period of public silence that preceded it. This is a pattern worth recognizing because it shows up in other political systems facing similar credibility questions during periods of leadership uncertainty. When direct reassurance through public appearance either isn't possible due to genuine health or security constraints, or isn't considered strategically wise, because a direct address might actually invite more scrutiny and skepticism than it resolves, demonstrating continued functional control through decisive action becomes an alternative way of answering the same underlying question. It doesn't necessarily resolve every question about the health or political explanation of the original silence, but it does answer a narrower, more immediately practical question. Is the government still capable of making and executing significant decisions, regardless of whatever is happening with the individual leader's personal visibility? Now let's talk about the decision itself and what it reveals about the broader strategic calculations happening within Iran's leadership right now. The specific choice of action taken after this extended silence wasn't incidental. In situations like this, the first visible decision following a period of significant uncertainty tends to be carefully chosen, specifically because of what it signals, not just because of its direct practical effect. A decision focused on external confrontation, doubling down on positions related to the broader regional conflict, signals a specific message: that whatever internal uncertainty existed during the period of silence has not translated into a weaker, more accommodating external posture. If anything, decisions of this kind, taken specifically in the immediate aftermath of an extended period of public absence, often serve a dual purpose, addressing whatever external strategic situation actually required the decision, while simultaneously reassuring internal hardline audiences that leadership remains resolute and unshaken by whatever generated the preceding silence. This dual-purpose framing matters enormously for understanding why the specific decision, whatever its direct practical content, likely received the level of internal deliberation and careful timing it appears to have received. Remember the internal power dynamics we've discussed in previous analyses of this broader conflict, the delicate balance between clerical leadership, the security and military establishment, and the broader population, all interconnected through a system where perceived strength and resolve function as a core currency of political survival. A leader, returning from an extended period of unexplained silence, faces a specific kind of internal political vulnerability. precisely because that silence, regardless of its actual cause, inevitably generates some level of internal questioning about continued fitness and capability to lead. The most direct way to address that vulnerability isn't necessarily through explanation, which risks drawing even more attention to whatever uncertainty existed during the absence. It's through decisive action that demonstrates, without requiring any explanation at all, that leadership remains firmly in control of the country's strategic direction. There's a particular kind of decision that tends to serve this dual purpose most effectively, and it's worth understanding why. Decisions with clear, unambiguous, externally visible consequences tend to work better for this specific credibility restoration purpose than more subtle or gradual policy shifts, precisely because unambiguous action leaves less room for internal factions or outside observers to question whether the decision genuinely originated from firm, centralized authority versus reflecting some kind of compromise or continued uncertainty at the top. This is part of why moments like this one so often produce decisions on the more assertive, confrontational end of the available spectrum, rather than more measured, incremental policy adjustments, even when a more measured approach might arguably serve the underlying strategic situation just as well or better. The credibility restoration function of the decision, in other words, can end up shaping its content just as much as the underlying strategic merits of the decision itself. If this kind of honest breakdown of how leadership actually manages these credibility questions is something you want more of, tap that like button right now. It genuinely helps this video reach more people who are tired of surface-level speculation and actually want to understand the strategy underneath moments like this. Let's talk about how outside observers, particularly American and allied intelligence and diplomatic communities, are likely interpreting this specific sequence, because their read on the situation matters enormously for how the broader conflict trajectory unfolds from here. Extended leadership silence during an active conflict typically triggers significant intelligence and analytical attention, precisely because it represents exactly the kind of ambiguous signal that could indicate several very different underlying realities, each carrying dramatically different strategic implications. If the silence reflected genuine health issues serious enough to raise real succession concerns, that possibility alone would likely reshape how outside governments think about negotiation strategy, potential windows for diplomatic breakthrough, and the broader stability calculus of continuing versus easing pressure on the regime during a period of genuine internal uncertainty. If the silence instead reflected internal political struggle among competing factions, that possibility would suggest a different kind of opportunity and a different kind of risk around whether continued external pressure might accelerate internal fracture, or whether it might instead unify competing factions against a common external threat during a moment of internal vulnerability. The specific decisive action taken once the silence broke likely gets read by outside analysts as a data point helping to narrow down which of these explanations is most likely accurate, even though it almost certainly doesn't resolve the question with complete certainty. A decision reflecting continued strategic coherence and capability suggests at minimum that whatever caused the silence hasn't produced a genuine breakdown in the government's basic capacity to formulate and execute decisions. That's meaningfully different from a scenario where the silence reflected a genuine leadership vacuum, one where competing factions were unable to agree on a coordinated response to ongoing events, a scenario that would likely have produced continued visible drift and inaction rather than a clear, decisive move once the silence finally broke. This doesn't mean outside observers can now confidently rule out the more serious explanations for the original silence. A decisive action can still be produced by a government experiencing real internal strain, particularly if a dominant faction, even one operating amid genuine internal disagreement or uncertainty about leadership succession, retains enough control to direct policy and command structures effectively. What the decisive action does suggest, at minimum, is that whatever internal uncertainty exists hasn't yet produced the kind of visible, prolonged paralysis that would represent the most dangerous and destabilizing outcome from a regional security perspective. A genuine breakdown in command and control during an active conflict, with all the unpredictable, dangerous consequences that kind of breakdown could potentially produce. Now let's talk about the domestic messaging dimension of this sequence, because how this story gets presented to Iran's own population reveals just as much as the underlying decision itself. Remember the pattern we've discussed in previous analyses of how this government manages information for its own domestic audience? The tendency to project confidence and control specifically for internal consumption, regardless of what's actually happening behind closed doors. Expect state media coverage of this sequence to frame the extended silence, if it's acknowledged at all, in the most reassuring terms possible, likely emphasizing routine, unremarkable explanations, while highlighting the decisive action that followed as evidence of continued strong, capable leadership, rather than addressing directly whatever specific concerns generated the speculation during the actual period of absence. This kind of messaging strategy makes sense from the government's own internal perspective, even though it inevitably generates skepticism among more sophisticated domestic and international observers who recognize the pattern for what it likely represents. Directly addressing health rumors, succession speculation, or internal political struggle would require acknowledging vulnerabilities. That this specific system has spent decades treating as existential threats to project any hint of, given how heavily its legitimacy depends on maintaining an image of unified, unshakable strength both to its own population and to external adversaries. The safer strategic choice from the government's own risk calculation is almost always to simply move forward, letting decisive action speak for itself while avoiding any direct engagement with the underlying questions the extended silence originally raised. There's a limit to how effectively this strategy can work over time, though, and it's worth understanding that limit clearly. A single instance of unexplained silence followed by decisive action can plausibly be absorbed into a narrative of routine, unremarkable governance, especially if state media successfully controls the domestic information environment around the story. Repeated instances of this pattern, extended silences followed by unexplained reappearances through action rather than direct communication, become progressively harder to explain away as routine, especially as informal information networks, foreign media coverage accessed through workarounds despite official restrictions, and simple accumulated pattern recognition among Iran's own population and internal political establishment gradually make this kind of pattern more difficult to dismiss as coincidental or unremarkable over time. Let's talk about what this specific sequence might mean for the broader trajectory of the conflict. Because leadership uncertainty at the top of any government involved in an active, high-stakes confrontation carries real strategic implications that extend well beyond the immediate question of who's actually making decisions day to day. One important consideration is how this affects the calculus around potential negotiated resolution to the broader standoff. Extended leadership uncertainty can cut in genuinely opposite directions here, and it's worth being honest that either outcome remains plausible. On one hand, uncertainty at the top could create genuine openings for more pragmatic factions within the government to push for de-escalation, calculating that continued conflict. Under conditions of internal leadership, uncertainty carries risks that outweigh whatever strategic benefits continued confrontation might otherwise offer. On the other hand, exactly the same uncertainty could push the government in the opposite direction, toward more aggressive, confrontational posturing, specifically designed to project strength and unity precisely because internal uncertainty makes that kind of external assertiveness feel more politically necessary, not less, to whichever faction currently holds the most influence over immediate decision-making. Historical comparisons offer some guidance here, though never a definitive answer, since every political system carries its own specific internal dynamics that resist simple generalization. Governments facing genuine leadership uncertainty during active external conflicts have, in various historical cases, moved in both directions, depending heavily on the specific balance of power among competing internal factions at the moment uncertainty emerged. Where hardline security-focused factions already held disproportionate influence before the period of uncertainty began, leadership transitions or extended uncertainty periods have often reinforced that existing dominance, producing more assertive, less compromising external postures precisely during the period when outside observers might otherwise expect increased flexibility, where more pragmatic or reform-oriented factions had already established meaningful influence before the uncertainty began. Similar periods have sometimes instead produced genuine openings toward negotiated resolution, precisely because those factions were positioned to use the moment of transition to advance positions they'd already been quietly building support for. Which pattern applies here depends heavily on exactly the kind of internal factional balance that remains, frustratingly, almost entirely opaque to outside observation. Another important consideration is how this affects the reliability and predictability of Iran's decision-making more broadly, something that matters enormously for how other governments, both adversaries and potential negotiating partners, calibrate their own strategic responses. A government experiencing genuine internal uncertainty at the top, even if it retains basics, functional capacity to make and execute decisions, may become somewhat less predictable and consistent in its broader strategic behavior, as different internal factions gain and lose relative influence over specific decisions depending on the particular circumstances and internal political dynamics surrounding each individual moment. This kind of reduced predictability creates real challenges for any government or diplomatic process attempting to negotiate consistently with Iran, because the same government, depending on which internal faction currently holds more influence at any given moment, might send meaningfully different signals about its actual willingness to negotiate, escalate, or maintain the current standoff indefinitely. There's also a succession dimension worth considering carefully, even though it's genuinely difficult to discuss with much confidence, given how tightly this specific system has historically controlled information about succession planning. Extended leadership silence, especially involving the most senior figure in the country's political and religious hierarchy, inevitably raises questions about succession preparedness, questions this system has historically preferred to manage through careful, controlled internal processes, rather than any kind of public discussion or transparent planning. If this specific instance of silence does reflect genuine health concerns, serious enough to eventually require a leadership transition, however that transition might unfold, the broader implications for regional stability and the trajectory of the current conflict could be significant, potentially reshaping calculations by every government currently involved in or affected by this broader standoff. It's worth understanding just how consequential a genuine succession moment would be for a system built the way this one is built, because the comparison to more institutionalized political systems is instructive here. In systems with clear, established constitutional succession processes, a leadership transition, even an unexpected one, tends to proceed through relatively predictable, stabilizing mechanisms that reassure both domestic populations and international observers that continuity of governance is essentially guaranteed, regardless of who specifically occupies the top position. This system has no comparable, transparent mechanism. Succession here has historically depended on a combination of religious credentialing, negotiated consensus among senior clerical and security figures, and internal political maneuvering that can, and has, in comparable historical cases, in other similarly structured systems, produced periods of genuine instability and competing claims to authority during the transition itself. If a genuine succession process is quietly beginning, behind the extended silence this video has focused on, the stakes involved extend far beyond simply replacing one individual with another. They potentially involve a fundamental renegotiation of the internal balance of power that has defined this entire system for decades. Let's talk about what to watch for in the coming weeks and months, because there are specific signals worth paying attention to that will likely tell you more about the true underlying situation than any single decisive action or piece of state media coverage possibly could on its own. The first thing to watch is whether this pattern repeats. Additional periods of unexplained silence followed by decisive action rather than direct public communication. A single instance can plausibly be explained through routine, unremarkable circumstances. A repeating pattern becomes significantly harder to dismiss and would suggest something more structurally significant is happening, whether related to health, security, or internal political dynamics, rather than a simple, isolated, coincidental gap in an otherwise consistent pattern of public visibility. The second thing to watch is how the broader political and security establishment responds to this sequence, particularly whether any signs of internal factional tension become visible, even indirectly, through changes in official statements, personnel, movements, or shifts in which officials appear. Most prominently in state media coverage during and after periods of leadership silence. These kinds of subtle signals often provide more reliable information about genuine internal dynamics than any direct statement or decisive action, precisely because they're harder for the government to fully control and manage compared to more centralized, deliberate messaging efforts. The third thing to watch is whether international intelligence assessments, to whatever extent they eventually become publicly available through official statements, leaked reporting, or subsequent diplomatic and policy shifts, offer any additional clarity about the actual cause of the original silence. Intelligence agencies with access to information well beyond what's publicly available often develop reasonably confident assessments about exactly this kind of leadership. Uncertainty question, even when that assessment remains classified and doesn't become publicly confirmed for years, if ever. Watching for subsequent policy shifts among governments engaged with Iran, shifts that might reflect updated internal intelligence assessments, even without any explicit public acknowledgement of what prompted them, can offer indirect but genuinely useful signals about what's actually happening behind the scenes. There's a broader lesson here too, one that extends well beyond this specific instance of leadership silence and speaks to something important about how authoritarian systems generally manage exactly this kind of uncertainty. Systems that depend heavily on projecting continuous, unshakable strength and control face a genuine structural vulnerability whenever that continuity gets disrupted, whether through health issues, security concerns, or internal political struggle. Unlike more transparent political systems, where leadership transitions and even significant health issues are typically managed through established, publicly understood processes that don't fundamentally threaten the broader system's legitimacy. Authoritarian systems, built around the specific persona and perceived strength of a single leader, often lack those same institutional buffers, making any disruption to that leader's visible presence and apparent capability a moment of genuine, if often carefully hidden, systemic vulnerability. That's an important thing to understand about this broader conflict, not just this specific incident. The strategic calculations of every government currently involved in or affected by this standoff depend partly on their read of Iran's internal stability and leadership capability. In moments like this one, extended silence followed by decisive action rather than direct explanation represent exactly the kind of ambiguous signal that different observers will likely interpret in dramatically different ways, depending on their own existing assumptions and strategic interests. There isn't a single, universally agreed interpretation of what this sequence actually means, and it's worth being honest about that uncertainty, rather than pretending any single explanation can be stated with complete confidence based on the limited, carefully controlled information actually available from outside this specific government's own tightly managed internal processes. There's also a human dimension worth acknowledging honestly here, one that's easy to lose entirely in a conversation focused purely on strategic calculation and political signaling. Whatever the actual explanation for this extended silence turns out to be, health concerns, security precautions, or internal political maneuvering, there's a real individual at the center of this story, along with a broader population of tens of millions of people whose daily lives and immediate future depend heavily on decisions being made by a leadership structure whose internal workings remain almost entirely opaque to the people most directly affected by those decisions. That opacity itself represents a genuine governance failure, regardless of how effectively this specific government manages to project confidence and continuity through carefully chosen decisive actions rather than direct, honest communication with its own population about what's actually happening at the top of the system that governs their daily lives. It's worth sitting with what that opacity actually costs ordinary people living under this kind of system. In a more transparent political environment, a period of leadership uncertainty, whatever its cause, would typically be accompanied by at least some baseline level of public information, official medical updates, transparent succession protocols, or simply a functioning free press capable of investigating and reporting accurately on what's actually happening. None of that exists in any meaningful form here. Ordinary Iranians are left to interpret exactly the same ambiguous signals. This video has spent time unpacking extended silence followed by unexplained decisive action, with even less access to independent analysis and reliable information than outside observers have, despite the fact that they're the population most directly and immediately affected by whatever is actually happening at the top of their own government. That asymmetry between how much genuine uncertainty ordinary citizens are forced to navigate and how little reliable information they're given to navigate it with is itself one of the more quietly consequential aspects of this entire story. What we can say with real confidence is this: extended leadership silence, followed by decisive action rather than direct public reappearance and explanation, represents a specific, recognizable pattern that authoritarian systems often use to manage exactly this kind of credibility and continuity question, without ever having to directly address the underlying uncertainty that originally generated the key concern. Whether this specific instance reflects genuine health issues, security precautions, internal political struggle, or some combination of all three, remains genuinely uncertain from outside observation, and will likely remain uncertain for some time, given how tightly this particular government has historically controlled information about exactly these kinds of internal dynamics. What's clear, regardless of the underlying explanation, is that the decisive action taken once the silence broke was almost certainly chosen carefully, specifically because of what it signals about continued functional control, rather than simply because of its direct practical effect on the broader conflict. Understanding that distinction between action taken for its practical strategic value and action taken partly, or even primarily, for what it communicates about internal stability and control is essential for correctly interpreting not just this specific moment, but whatever comes next in this still unfolding, still genuinely uncertain situation. If this video helped you actually understand the real signal behind a story, most coverage reduced to a single dramatic headline, that's exactly why this channel exists. Subscribe, share this with someone who's tired of the surface-level version of complicated political stories, and I'll see you in the next one, where we go even deeper into the forces quietly shaping the decisions defining this conflict.